Hey everybody, it's Roxanbox90 here with my top 10 EDH Commander card countdown for Born of the Gods. So I know people have been asking for this for a while, but I didn't want to rush into it before the pre-release, and I had a bunch of other Born of the Gods related stuff coming, so that's why this video is a little late, but I hope you'll forgive me. This is my top 10 list. So again, like my other top 10 lists, I try to keep the criteria fairly similar, which is that the cards that are the most niche, the most limited, the most specific cards tend to go at the end of the list towards the 10, and as the cards get more universal, also more useful and cooler for a wider number of decks, especially a wider number of colors, that's as we get towards number 1. So bear that in mind. In terms of honorable mentions, we have first off Heroes Podium. This card is very powerful for the right deck, but it's incredibly narrow. It only really works in legendary decks such as Captain Saisei builds, and that's why this card is in an honorable mention. It's good, but for such a narrow number of decks. So Captain Saisei players, have fun. Then we had Arbiter of Ideal, which is also a pretty strong card. It has evasion. The Inspired ability can play absolute shenanigans in the right deck because you can check out the top cards and make sure you have the right one. But the Inspired mechanic is fairly weak in EDH in that it requires a lot of work to consistently activate, and this card's mana cost is pretty high. Astral Cornucopia, this card's a lot of fun, it's very cool. I'm sure with infinite combos and other things this card will be very powerful in the right deck, but I really don't think that as a universal design it's going to see a lot of play. Things like Darksteel Ingot will activate more regularly and are stronger long term. Then we had Champion of the Stray Souls. A lot of people love this card, and I think it's great also. Sad that it is not legendary, but as such it's going to see a good amount of play in a number of decks regardless. It's a good card, but it's also very niche, very expensive, and only works in certain archetypes. There are better cards than it. And lastly, in the honorable mentions, we have Tremocritus. He's awesome, and obviously will be a very fun aggro blue general, which there aren't a ton of, but he's fairly narrow otherwise, and to me, he can be a little boring in terms of his overall design. He's obviously a commander design card, but he doesn't fit into nearly as many decks as we think. The actual list will start out with number 10, Brimaz, King of Oreskos. It's funny, I saw this guy was actually near the top of MTG Mythic Text list, and he's awesome, trust me. But for me, I found this card was definitely at the end of the list, according to my criteria, because he's very narrow. Yes, he's going to be a lot of fun for aggro white decks, or even aggro 2-color decks. He's going to be a very, very strong card to fill the 3-drop, especially if the commander's not in the 3 slot. With Vigilance, he's token producer that's consistent. He's a very solid card, but he's not going to be nearly as good nor as universal in EDH Commander as he is going to be seeing in standard play. Number 9, we have Kiora the Crashing Wave. Planeswalkers tend to rate pretty high on the list just because they're really good and they fit into a lot of decks. She, not so much. She's 2 colors, so she'll only fit in 2, 3, 5 color decks, mostly 2 and 3 color decks, and her abilities are not incredibly awesome for EDH. She starts with 2 loyalty, which is very low. She prevents from a permanent, but this doesn't mean nearly as much as because there are so many more ways to deal with that ability, and it doesn't even get rid of the permanent, it just prevents it for 1 turn. Not the best protection spell, especially in multiplayer. The -1 is fine, draws a card, you may play additional land, that's good, but people will quickly deal with her if that ability becomes anything relevant. Even as such, it's not a huge advantage for the amount of mana you're putting into her, and her final ability is not going to win games, at least multiplayer games, by any means. So she's a fairly narrow cost, and her abilities are not nearly as powerful. We'll see some play, but not a lot of play. 8, we have Karametra, God of the Harvest. She's okay, she's fine. She'll work in a lot of decks. The only thing is, she's a boring 6/7, who, when you cast a creature spell, will give you a forest or plains. She's a fairly straightforward ramp card, and given that she costs 5 mana to cast, I think that a lot of decks would rather run better ramp stuff than she is. Then we had Fated Return at number 7, and this card, yes, it's 3 black mana, which makes it a little harder to cast, but by the time you're going to play it up at turn 7, many decks will have this mana cost. What makes it really important is that it can put creature cards from any graveyard instantly into play with Indestructible. This is really good if you want to get your commanders back. It's also really good for stealing huge bombs, and the fact that you can do it during someone else's turn makes it very versatile. I'm sure this will see a lot of play in quite a few decks, and I myself will definitely be running it. The 3 black mana cost is really what holds it down on the list. Then we had Fated Retribution at number 6. This card is an instant speed Wrath, and that is awesome. The fact that it kills Planeswalkers is also a big deal these days, and Rout, its most comparable card, doesn't hit Planeswalkers. That being said, it is 3 white also, which is what's keeping it lower on the list. 5, we have Ephara, God of the Polis. She is fantastic, not only because she's reasonably costed, but the fact is almost every turn, not every turn, but almost every turn, she draws you a card with no penalty, which means that she's a slightly costier Phyrexian Arena that doesn't hurt you and will likely give you more card advantage than Phyrexian Arena would long term because she's indestructible. Protects herself, great mana cost, very easy to abuse. Card advantage EDH means a lot. I think she's going to go very far in this format. She may look deceptive, but she's quite a powerhouse for this format, especially in multiplayer. Then we have at number 4, Xenagos, God of Revels. And the reason I love this guy is because even if he just sits in play, he gives any creature coming into play under your control double power and gives it haste. This matters a lot for aggro decks that would run him, which are anything aggro running these colors. You can get your commander into a Voltron position very easily since it gives haste, which is a really great indicator. He also works very well in creature-heavy decks, which a lot of decks run in these colors. And I do think that he's going to have a surefire place in quite a few number of decks, not only because he's a consistent activator, but he consistently gives haste. And I personally think that he is fantastic. Most aggro decks will definitely have to consider running him in the future. Then we have number 3, Perplexing Chimera. I know a lot of people might yell at me for this card, but I think it fits into a lot of decks. It is deceptively powerful, I think. It's really, really strong. Yes, it's an enchantment creature, so it's more susceptible to removal, but it's easily splashable, and it locks down the field. It is incredibly strong. It will warp games around itself, since suddenly no one will want to play the card if this guy's in play. And what's great is that since you exchange control of it with someone else, then the other player will get this card, which means that it can cycle around the field and be very multiplayer conscious. I'm pretty sure if it works as I think it does, I really love it, and that's why it's number 3. Number 2 is Unravel the Aether. Yes, it's not one of the most powerful cards in this list, and I don't even know how to pronounce the AE. Is it Aether? Aether? Whatever. It's awesome. I love it that it's incredibly cheap. It's very versatile. Tucking stuff matters, and for an artifact or enchantment, being able to shuffle it back into its owner's library is really good. Green hasn't had a card like this. There are other cards like Oblation or Chaos Warp that do this work, and yes, they hit more than just artifact or enchantments, but I do think this card will see a lot of consideration and a lot of play, especially in budget builds. It fits into most any deck running green, and I think it's a really fantastic card at number 2. Number 1, Spirit of the Labyrinth. This card is so cool on the flavor level, on the everything level. This card is fantastic. Yes, it's 2 for 3/1, which doesn't usually mean much in EDH, but what matters is its ability, that each player can't draw more than 1 card each turn. This is a huge deal. Card advantage matters a tremendous amount in EDH, and this card makes sure that the entire field is locked down. Now, a lot of players might consider this unfair, but Stacks decks will love this guy. What's also great is any aggro deck that can't compete with control decks because they're drawing so many cards, this card will enable them to compete. It's much stronger than Thalia in this format, and I think this card will, every deck that's running Thalia or trying to handle control that's overwhelming them with their card advantage, this card will fill a slot. It is aggressively costed, so if you're running in 1v1 or you're running in multiplayer, this card can easily fit on the curve. And I think not only is it splashable into most every aggro deck in existence that runs the color, but it also will enable aggro in the long term to deal with a lot of control and combo decks out there. Those are my top 10 EDH Commander cards for Born of the Gods. If you guys liked the video, tap the like button, then head down to the comment section to let me know your thoughts on these cards. Remember, this is my opinion, so keep your comments constructive, but I really would love to talk with you guys about the cards down below. If you're new to the channel and you want to see more top 10 lists, subscribe, and as always, Roxabox90 signing out. I'll see you guys next time.